Welcome to the deep dive. This is where we take a whole stack of historical sources, sometimes dense, sometimes conflicting, and really boil them down, synthesize them, so you get the essential knowledge, the full picture.
And today we're diving into something intense. A period of fighting on the Eastern Front, about 15 months long, that often gets lost in the shadows of, the bigger names like Stalingrad or the Battle of Moscow.
Right. We're talking about the Battles of Rzhev, an absolute inferno that raged from early 1942 right through to March 1943.
It was so brutal, so utterly costly in lives, that it earned a truly chilling nickname, the Rzhevskaya Мясорубка.
The Rzhev Meat Grinder. Just the name tells you something.
It really does.
And this town, Rzhev, it seems small on the map, maybe insignificant to us now, but back then, strategically, it was huge.
Absolutely pivotal. Only about 180 kilometers west of Moscow. For the Germans, it was this vital cornerstone, a wave breaker holding the line. For the Soviets, it was a target they just had to take back.
So our mission today, it's more than just listing dates and casualties, right? Though the numbers are, frankly, mind-boggling.
Yeah, we need to unpack the why. Why hold this salient at such an insane cost? What was the strategic thinking, or maybe the lack of it? What were the actual operations like on the ground?
And the human cost. We have to get into that. For the soldiers, obviously, but also the civilians caught in the middle of this non-stop battlefield.
Exactly. Understand why it became the meat grinder.
Okay, let's start unpacking. Context first.
Yeah.
Why Rzhev? What made this town so critical beyond just being, relatively close to Moscow?
Location.
Wow.
It's sitting right there on the upper Volga River, which is important. But the real key, transport.
Ah, the railways and roads.
Precisely. It was a major hub. Connects Moscow to Smolensk, Novgorod, Vyazma. Vital arteries for Army Group Center. Holding Rzhev meant the Germans kept that direct threat aimed at Moscow.
Which forced the Soviets to commit huge forces just to contain it, right?
Absolutely. Tied them down. Now, timeline-wise, this all kicks off right after the Soviets pushed the Germans back from Moscow's gates. Late 41, early 42.
So the Germans had grabbed Rzhev earlier, in October 41, the 206th Infantry Division.
That's right. They secured it, reached the Volga. And holding on to it, well, that leads us straight into this massive clash of ideas at the very top of the German command.
You mean Hitler versus his generals?
Pretty much. The whole reason this salient was defended so fanatically at such hideous cost comes down to Hitler's Haltebefehl, the hold order.
Right, that famous order. Let's get specific. When did it come down and what exactly did it demand?
December 20th, 1941.
Yeah.
Right as the winter crisis was hitting the Wehrmacht hard, and the order was stark. No tactical withdrawals, none.
Just stand and die.
Essentially, yes. Fanatical resistance was the phrase used. Didn't matter if your flanks were exposed, didn't matter if you were about to be cut off. You hold.
What was the thinking there? It sounds, from a purely military perspective, insane.
It was partly psychological. Hitler had this deep-seated fear, maybe stemming from World War I, that any retreat, even a planned one, could trigger a total collapse, panic, loss of morale.
Like pulling one thread unravels the whole thing.
Kind of. And he also understood the value of keeping that pressure on Moscow, symbolically and practically.
But the commanders on the ground, they must have seen the reality, the winter, the conditions.
Oh, they absolutely did. Heinz Guderian, the Panzer general, he argued forcefully for a more flexible approach, an elastic defense.
What did he propose?
He pointed out the obvious. The ground was frozen solid, like rock, maybe 1.5 meters deep. You couldn't dig proper trenches, build real fortifications. He wanted an organized withdrawal to better defensive ground, maybe around Smolensk, save troops, shorten the line.
Makes sense, conserve strength.
Totally logical, but his arguments, completely ignored, dismissed.
And Kluge, the field marshal.
Von Kluge just doubled down on Hitler's order, made it absolutely clear. Everyone must hold where he stands. And that set the stage. That rigidity locked the Ninth Army into this brutal attritional fight.
Meanwhile, the Soviets, they just had this huge success pushing the Germans back from Moscow. Now their eyes are fixed on this Rzhev bulge.
Right. Knuz-Kalin in front, Zhukov's west front. Their big goal for the winter offensive of 41-1.2 was simple: eliminate the salient. And Rzhev was the prize.
And they had momentum initially.
They did. The Germans were reeling. The Ninth Army started pulling back from Kalin in December 41. The Soviet 29th and 31st armies were pushing hard.
Kalin falls December 16th.
And that opens the door. Suddenly, a big pincer movement to cut off Rzhev itself looks possible. Very possible.
Which brings us to the first massive named operation.
Correct.
The Rzhev Offensive Operation, January, February 1942. This sounds like a real make-or-break moment for the Germans.
Oh, it was existential. The initial Soviet attack on January 4th just shattered the German main line,
Yeah.
punched a hole 15, maybe 20 kilometers wide.
Wow, and Soviet troops poured through.
Parts of the Soviet 39th Army, yeah. They got deep behind the German front near Rzhev. Suddenly, the German XC3 Army Corps is completely surrounded, cut off.
Relying entirely on air supply.
Yep. Desperate Luftwaffe flights trying to keep them alive. The situation was absolutely critical.
And this is where Walter Model enters the picture, takes command of the Ninth Army right in the middle of this chaos.
Exactly. He replaces Strauss on January 12th, arrives practically under fire in Seychevka, but Model wasn't the type to just sit and wait for the next blow.
He had a different philosophy, didn't he? Not just passive defense.
Completely different. His personal motto, apparently, was something like, attack, regain the initiative, dictate the law of trade to the enemy.
So proactive. Even when defending, find a way to hit back.
That was his core idea, counterpunch. Keep the enemy off balance. Don't let them mass their forces comfortably. It directly challenged that static, hold-at-all-costs mentality.
Doing that in the dead of winter, though.
Hi.
Minus 45 Celsius. That requires some serious improvisation.
Incredible improvisation. He couldn't just rely on standard tactics. He took panzer crews, armored infantry guys, and turned them into ad hoc ski hunter units. Mobile, hitting weak points.
And that snowshoe company.
The Schneeschuh Company, yeah, critical. He formed this special unit specifically for reconnaissance in the deep snow and, crucially, for protecting the Ninth Army's lifeline.
That single railway line, Rzhev, must have been constantly under attack.
All the time. Soviet partisans bypassed Red Army units. They were always hitting it. Model had to dedicate real resources, even an armored train with anti-aircraft guns, just to keep supplies flowing. His ability to manage that and launch counterattacks is why they called him the Lion of Defense.
So when he decided to counterattack to close that Soviet breakthrough, his own troops must have been thinking, are you serious in this cold?
You have to imagine the skepticism. Machine guns freezing up, vehicles struggling. But Model's response was famously blunt. The Russians are marching too. No excuses.
He gathered his mobile units, the 1st Panzer Division, SS Das Reich.
Yes, scraped together what he could and launched counterattacks near Nikolskoye and Solomino, aiming to cut off the Soviet forces that had pushed through.
And this leads to the Kessel battles, the encirclements, brutal stuff.
Brutal, but tactically successful for Model. His gamble worked. The German counter-thrust managed to link up the 6th and XC3 Corps again, severing the Soviet supply lines to the troops inside the pocket.
There was one unit holding that critical link.
The SS Regiment Der Führer. They were tasked with holding that vital narrow land bridge open while the pocket was reduced.
And the Soviets trapped inside.
Devastation. 7 Soviet divisions were eventually cornered in the Monchalova forest area and basically annihilated. The Soviet 29th Army effectively ceased to exist.
The German reports claimed huge numbers.
Yeah, the OKW report from late February 42 mentioned 27,000 Soviet dead, 5,000 prisoners, just from that one encirclement. The scale of the loss was immense.
But the term meat grinder implies it cut both ways. The German units involved paid a steep price too.
An unbelievable price. That same SS regiment, Der Führer, the one holding the corridor. By the end of the fighting, sources say they were down to just 35 men, 35 survivors from a whole regiment.
Good grief. A regiment to a platoon, basically.
That's the Rzhev story in miniature, isn't it?
Yeah.
Tactical success, yes, but achieved through near-total self-destruction.
Yeah.
Just horrific attrition.
Okay, so that initial winter crisis is contained, but the salient is still there. Moving into spring and summer 42. Model still has this problem of Soviet forces operating behind his lines, right?
A huge problem. It led directly to Operation Seydlitz in July 1942. This wasn't about gaining ground, it was about survival. You had the Soviet 39th Army, the 11th Cavalry Corps, still active in the rear areas.
Threatening that key supply road, the Smolensk-Vyazma roll-bump.
Exactly. If the Soviets cut that road consistently, Army Group Center would be in deep, deep trouble. Model had to clear them out.
And the terrain back there. Forests, swamps. Not easy for tanks.
Difficult terrain. So Model, again, improvised. He took his battered reconnaissance battalions and formed a special mobile cavalry command, the Cavalry Commando ZBV. 3 regiments on horseback.
Cavalry in 1942.
Sounds archaic, but for that terrain, it worked. Horses could go where vehicles couldn't. Mobility was key to hunting down the Soviet units in the forests around the Lechesa River.
And Seydlitz was successful, tactically.
Another German tactical win, yeah. They managed to encircle the Soviet forces. By mid-July, the operation was over. The Soviets lost around 50,000 casualties, according to German estimates.
And the Germans captured a lot of equipment.
Yeah, 230 tanks, over 700 artillery pieces. So, Seydlitz stabilized the rear, temporarily. But everyone knew the main Soviet summer offensive was still coming.
Which brings us to the Rzhev-Sikevka operation, July, August 1942. This sounds like the big one. Stalin throwing everything at the salient.
It was massive. The Soviets weren't just trying to take Rzhev anymore. The goal was bigger. Split. Army Group Center wide open. Drive for Smolensk and Vyazma.
And also, presumably, to pull German reserves away from the south. Stalingrad was heating up then.
Precisely. Relieve the pressure down south. And the forces they committed were staggering. 41 rifle divisions, 15 rifle brigades, 31 tank brigades.
How many tanks is that?
Over 1,700 tanks. Plus overwhelming artillery and air support, all aimed at Model's Ninth Army.
Imagine being a German soldier on that front line in the summer of 42. Constant rain turning everything to mud.
An absolute morass. It made movement hellish, but it didn't stop the attacks. On the northern part, near Rzhev itself, strong points like Polanino, Galichovo, they were getting hit sometimes 7 times a day, combined infantry and tank assaults. Non-stop.
And the German line was stretched thin.
Incredibly thin. Reports mention single companies trying to hold frontages of 1, even 2 kilometers.
Yeah.
Just impossible odds, really.
How did they hold? What stopped the breakthrough?
Oh, firepower. Concentrated defensive fire. The sources really emphasize the PaK, the anti-tank guns, the Flaks, the anti-aircraft guns used against ground targets. Coordinated fire, often with assault guns adding support. That's where we broke up the tank masses.
There's an example, IR-58.
Yeah, Infantry Regiment 58 reported knocking out over 20 T-34s in their sector on just one day, August 5th. That kind of intense anti-tank fighting was constant.
But the Soviets did achieve breakthroughs, particularly on the southern side near Syachevka.
They did. Even though the Germans apparently knew the attack was coming, there were reports of Soviet loudspeakers announcing it on July 30th. The sheer weight of the Soviet 31st and 20th Armies broke through initially.
Zhukov committed his reserves, Tank Corps.
Yep, the 6th and 8th Tank Corps went in, aiming straight for Syachevka. It was another moment of extreme crisis for the Germans.
But again, they managed to contain it. Counterattacks.
Just barely. It was chaotic. The 2nd Panzer Division actually got encircled for a time, but managed to fight its way back out. But the cost for the Soviets, again, astronomical. German accounts claim something like 460 Soviet tanks destroyed just during the counterattacks around Karmanovo before the Germans pulled back from there.
By the end of that summer's fighting, the landscape itself must have been unrecognizable.
Completely devastated. Sources compare it directly to the Somme in World War I. Just a wasteland of overlapping shell craters, mud, wreckage.
And inside Rzhev city.
Vicious, close quarters fighting. German troops battling Soviet tanks that were literally dug into shell craters, using them as hold-down fighting positions.
Yeah.
Just hellish, street by street, crater by crater fighting. Pure slaughterhouse conditions.
So summer 42 ends. Massive Soviet effort, immense losses on both sides, but the salient, incredibly, still holds. What's next? The final big push.
Operation Mars. Late 1942, November, December. This was the Soviets' last really major attempt to crack through Rzhev salient before, Stalingrad really became the absolute focus.
The second Rzhev-Syachevka offensive. Same objective, more force.
Pretty much. Kalinin and West Front's hitting again, using that overwhelming material advantage. They were trying to finally achieve the breakthrough that had eluded them all year.
And Model's Ninth Army. Still hanging on, attacked from multiple sides.
Attacked from 3 sides, yeah. And it wasn't just regular Red Army units anymore. The Soviets were even throwing in hastily formed Volksformulazen local militias from the area. Desperate fighting.
But Mars, it failed too, in terms of its main objectives.
It did. Despite the numbers, despite the desperation, the Soviets couldn't achieve a decisive breakthrough. And the cost. Again, just horrendous losses for the Red Army. Operation Mars is often seen as one of Zhukov's biggest failures, though it did succeed in pinning down German forces.
This whole cycle, it just highlights Hitler's mindset, doesn't it? That quote from Halder.
Yeah, General Halder, the chief of staff, recorded Hitler's reaction to the reports of ungeheuer Kräfteverschleiß, immense attrition in the Ninth Army. Hitler's response was chillingly simple. One must collapse, not us.
Just bleed the enemy dry, even if you're bleeding out yourself.
That's the strategy. A pure war of attrition, dictated from Berlin, regardless of the tactical reality or the human cost. Officers like von Gersdorf saw clearly a catastrophic military error, sacrificing vital troops and equipment for a piece of ground Hitler wouldn't give up.
And the Soviet perspective, if they didn't succeed, how did they frame it?
Well, for decades afterwards, Soviet historiography tended to downplay Rzhev. Because the Red Army didn't achieve its stated goals of liquidating the salient, it was often dismissed as fighting of local significance.
A way to mask the failures and the enormous cost.
Exactly. It conveniently hid the multitude of military misjudgments and the senseless and brutal sacrifice, as Volkogonov later put it.
But then Stalingrad happens. The German Sixth Army is destroyed. Suddenly, holding Rzhev doesn't make any sense, even to Hitler.
The strategic landscape changed completely after Stalingrad. Suddenly, Army Group Center needed to shorten its line, free up divisions. Even Hitler couldn't deny the necessity anymore.
So permission to withdraw is finally given.
February 6, 1943. The order comes down for Operation Büffelbewegung, the Buffalo Movement.
And the goal was purely practical. Shorten the front by, what was it, over 300 kilometers.
330 kilometers. A massive shortening of a line intended to stabilize the front and create reserves.
And this wasn't a rout. This was planned, meticulously prepared.
Highly engineered. The Ninth Army spent 4 weeks getting ready, building hundreds of kilometers of new roads and sled trails for the withdrawal, defining defensive lines and stages across a zone 100 kilometers deep. They had to pull back 29 divisions, maybe 250,000 men, without letting the Soviets crash through.
But the preparation also involved the scorched earth policy, a really dark part of the story.
Deeply dark. This wasn't just destroying military targets. This was systematic, planned devastation. The Economic Organization East plundered the area. Nearly 13,000 train wagons filled with grain, livestock, anything of value, shipped west.
Infrastructure destroyed. Villages burned.
Everything. Bridges, railways, settlements. Deliberately destroyed to leave absolutely nothing for the advancing Red Army. A true scorched earth.
And the civilians, what happened to them?
Horrific. Around 120,000 civilians were forced into labor, building rear defenses for the Germans, and another 60,000 were forcibly deported westward, basically cleared out the population.
So the withdrawal itself starts March 1st, 1943. Tricky timing with the weather.
Right as the spring thaw, the Rasputizi was beginning. Mud, freezing, thawing, terrible conditions. And as they pulled back, German engineers laid massive minefields, booby traps everywhere.
Making the Soviet advance costly even to empty towns.
Exactly, inflicting casualties even in retreat. But operationally, for the Germans, it was a success. They pulled the Ninth Army back 160 kilometers in about 21 days, establishing the new Buffalo position just before the mud made large-scale operations impossible.
And Rzhev itself is liberated March 3rd.
Liberated, yes, hours after the Germans blew the main Volga Bridge. The Soviets marched into a ghost town.
A ruin. And this brings us squarely to the numbers. The reason it's called the Meat Grinder. The casualties are hard to grasp.
They are staggering. And the figures themselves tell a story because they vary so wildly, especially on the Soviet side. It points to, well, chaos in record keeping, maybe deliberate suppression later on.
Let's talk Soviet losses first. What are the ranges we see?
Estimates go from around 400,000 wounded up to maybe 770,000 wounded, but the total dead. Some Russian historians now estimate it could be as high as 1.3 million Soviet soldiers killed over the course of their Rzhev battles.
Over 1 million dead. It's almost incomprehensible.
It really is. And the sources are quite clear. This wasn't just about facing tough German defenses. A huge part of this catastrophic loss rate was down to Soviet organizational failures.
Poor leadership, sending troops into hopeless attacks.
Repeatedly. Mass assaults, often poorly supported, against the same heavily fortified German positions, wave after wave. There's a horrifying statistic cited. In just the first 3 weeks of January 1942, 80,000 Soviet soldiers died.
80,000 in 3 weeks? That solidifies the meat grinder image perfectly. Just feeding lives into the machine.
It seems that way. A willingness to expend lives on a massive scale. The 29th and 39th armies were practically wiped out in those early phases, and the legacy is still being dug up, literally.
They're still finding remains.
Around 1,000 soldiers' remains are recovered every year in that area. Sometimes, as one account disturbingly noted, buried in 7 layers on top of each other.
7 layers?
My God.
Tells you everything about the intensity, doesn't it?
And the German losses. Also severe, even if the total numbers are lower.
Very severe for the forces involved. German figures usually cite around 160,000 killed, maybe 470,000 wounded for the Ninth Army over that period. Some estimates push the German death toll closer to 330,000, an absolutely draining, unsustainable level of attrition directly caused by that refusal to withdraw earlier.
When you pair these numbers with eyewitness accounts, the horror becomes very real. There's that account from a soldier in the 17th Guard Rifle Division, summer 42. He said, "In the whole war, I have seen nothing more terrible. He described bomb craters full of water, wreckage everywhere, dead horses, and just corpses everywhere. A landscape saturated with death.
And the civilians who remained, or were caught?
Rzhev itself was virtually erased. Population dropped from 56,000 to maybe 150 people by the time the Red Army arrived. Those who survived deportation or forced labor often endured atrocities. There are accounts of Wehrmacht actions against civilians in villages like Maloye Pisholino. And later, mass graves were found, possibly holding up to 70,000 victims. The destruction was comprehensive.
So, given this scale, this horror,
Right.
why was it sidelined in history for so long, particularly in the Soviet Union?
It was largely about narrative control. The official Soviet history couldn't easily accommodate such a costly failure, or perceived failure. It exposed poor decision-making, the senseless and brutal sacrifices of so many soldiers. Admitting that openly was difficult, politically dangerous even.
General Kaganov called it one of the greatest catastrophes of the war.
But that was much later, after the Soviet Union had collapsed. During the Cold War, Rzhev is largely footnote territory.
But the memory didn't completely die. It surfaced in art.
It did. Alexander Tverdovsky's poem from 45 or 46, I Was Killed Near Rzhev, is incredibly powerful. It kept the memory alive in a cultural sense.
And now there's a major monument.
Yes. Unveiled in 2020, a striking 25-meter-high sculpture. A Soviet soldier. But his lower body seems to dissolve into a flock of cranes, cranes being a potent Russian symbol for fallen soldiers. It's a very moving, very modern acknowledgement of the sacrifice.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground in this deep dive. The strategic trap Rzhev became, Hitler's disastrous hold-fast order, models often brilliant but costly defense, the major operations like Seydlitz, Mars, the Rzhev battles.
And the horrific cost of the Büffelbewegung retreat, the scorched earth, and ultimately the staggering human toll, over 1 million Soviet dead possibly, hundreds of thousands of Germans, that truly defines the Rzhev Meat Grinder.
So let's step back. Rzhev wasn't a decisive turning point like Stalingrad. The Soviets didn't achieve their main objective of crushing the salient until the Germans chose to withdraw. So what's the ultimate strategic takeaway here? What did Rzhev mean for the war?
I think Rzhev is a brutal lesson in the cost of attrition and strategic rigidity. Yes, the Soviets didn't win in the conventional sense during the main battles, but the fighting around Rzhev successfully pinned down huge numbers of elite German troops and bled Army Group Center white.
Forces that could have made a difference elsewhere, like Stalingrad.
Absolutely. Germany couldn't afford that kind of meat grinder. The Red Army tragically could, or at least its leadership was willing to pay that price. So Rzhev achieved a strategic objective for the Soviets, eroding German strength near Moscow permanently, but only through an almost unimaginable expenditure of human life. It was attritional victory through sheer sacrifice.
Which leaves us with a thought, maybe for you listening. We tend to focus on the battles that dramatically shifted the map, the famous victories and defeats. But Rzhev was different. It was this relentless grinding consumption of armies.
Mm-hmm.
How many other forgotten infernos like Rzhev were there?
Mm-hmm.
Battles that didn't necessarily change borders immediately, but fundamentally altered the course of the war simply by destroying the fighting power, the very substance of the armies involved. Maybe strategic exhaustion, bought at this kind of horrific price, was often the real deciding factor.
Rzhev certainly makes you think about that. The quiet, grinding battles might have been just as decisive as the famous turning points. A sobering thought.
A vital, if grim, piece of the Eastern Front puzzle brought back into focus. Thanks for joining us on The Deep Dive.